Hello. Oh, it does work. There we go. Hey, last lecture of term. Oh yeah, where's it gone? Oh no, did it? Is it on? Oh, where's the slide? Oh, darn. Yeah, there we go. Right, well done. Some of you all handed in. Well done on not going straight to the pub. Today we go to the pub and then come back. Oh, why not? Oh, okay. Well, it's nice to see you all here. Right, so, yes, Brexit. Been trying, well, just sort of talking about that all that term, and I've sort of been writing this lecture for the last 2 weeks and then rewriting it as it has changed. So, yes. So that was sort of my initial response in the first few days following Brexit, not particularly to the results. More that's just the sound I like to think of the British Constitution being written in real time. And I think that's pretty much what we've seen over the last sort of, the last couple of years really. So it's going to be debated for quite some time whether Brexit broke, changed, or will change our constitution. And even if it hasn't done any of those things, it certainly posed some questions for it, for those sort of central features of it. Of course, and perhaps it's also exposed the difficulty with an unwritten constitution. There were questions posed of it. What did the referendum mean? And we just didn't have an easy answer written down. We had to go to court to find out. And we're still sort of debating those questions now. So, yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about sort of what has happened in the last 2 years in sort of 3 discrete chunks. So the effect of the referendum, then sort of the Article 50 sort of debate, Miller, and then sort of the 2017 general election until now. And I'm going to sort of analyse what's happened, or to what extent what's happened in relation to them is in accordance with the rule of law, parliamentary sovereignty, and the separation of powers. And what I'm going to argue is that, on the whole, everybody has acted more or less in accordance with what the Constitution requires. So in terms of parliamentary sovereignty, the rule of law, separation of powers. But what I'm ultimately going to conclude is that hasn't worked. And we are where we are because the normal rules of separation of powers, mainly, where the exec dominates Parliament, has not been able to deal with what we have at the moment. And I'm going to suggest that in some parts that's due to the nature of Brexit, but mostly I think it's because the government didn't get a majority in the 2017 election. I think if they had, we'd probably be sort of leaving next week because of the exec dominance of Parliament. And I think, crucially, so the question is, are we where we are because the Constitution didn't work? Or are we where we are because the Constitution didn't work plus that election result? Honestly, I think that's so that's sort of where I'm going to end up with. Everybody's tried to act in accordance with parliamentary sovereignty, separation of powers, rule of law, and it just hasn't. It's created problems because we've tried to sort of follow all those rules. And I'm going to suggest that there are different options now to make the Constitution work. So, yes, not so much keep calm and carry on as simply, So, the effects of the referendum then. So, to begin at the beginning, under Dyson parliamentary sovereignty, legally, no source, we all know this, higher than Parliament, and no act or other body that can ultimately bind Parliament. And from this perspective, the referendum had no legal binding force. Okay, it was perfectly lawful for Parliament to ignore it. So, as you can see on their handout, acts bringing about referendums can state what the effect of that referendum is going to be. So the Northern Ireland Act says that if there is ever a referendum on the Northern Ireland rejoining or joining the Republic, then a minister must bring forward legislation. Okay, so Acts of Parliament can say what happens in response to a referendum, but the European Union Referendum Act 2015 didn't say that. It did not say what the effect of the referendum would be. It contained no requirement to implement the results. It gave no time frame, no sort of guide. And as a result, when it happened, nobody really knew what to do. Okay, you might remember that picture. Okay, the leaders of the Leave campaign the following morning, very tired, obviously, and just not really knowing what to do. And that's because the Act didn't tell them what to do, and our Constitution didn't clearly say what should happen next. So perhaps a slight problem with an unwritten Constitution. Okay. It had a new situation, and yes, we evolve and so on, and our Constitution evolves, but at that moment we didn't quite know what to do. There had been various statements sort of during the campaign that by several ministers saying that the result would be treated as binding. But the Supreme Court held that that wasn't the law, that wasn't the Constitution, those were just political statements. However, as we know in Dicey, Dicey says that Parliament can make or unmake any law. Okay? But even he, that's the legal principle, Dicey's legal principle of parliamentary sovereignty. But even he recognised that there were perhaps political and moral limitations. Things which he said Parliament never would, or to speak plainly, he says never could pass. So although there was nothing to legally require Parliament to enact Article 50, the political climate at the time makes it very difficult to see how it could have done anything else. Perhaps if politicians had acted differently in the run-up or in the immediate aftermath, then things might have been slightly different. But my feeling at the time and since was certainly then, there wasn't really, sort of politically the pressure was such that Article 50 had to leave, the referendum had to be treated as binding. So yes, okay, we've got the legal rules of parliamentary sovereignty, but you know this, it's sort of, we have the legality of it, but it's open to debate, open to sort of interpretation, open to argument. What is the extent of parliamentary sovereignty? So yeah, ultimately the EU sort of Notification of Withdrawal Act passed with a large majority across both parties. In retrospect, with a week to go, starting the clock ticking may not have been the best idea, but I don't really see how anything else politically could have been done. One of the great temptations of leadership is always to do something and to show that you have power. And perhaps this is one of the times when leadership might have been not to do anything, but politically that's what had to be done. So, although the referendum didn't legally change the Dicean orthodoxy of parliamentary sovereignty, okay, so parliamentary sovereignty is still there, still Dicey's legal principle, make or unmake any law. I would suggest that perhaps fundamentally something did shift between the individual and the state. So this is one point at which I think there might have been a slight change to the Constitution, but it's at a very deep, fundamental level. So in my research on the Human Rights Act within the UK, I found statistical evidence that, so although the Human Rights Act struggled to gain sort of popularity in England initially, it was very popular in the other countries of the United Kingdom, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And my theory as to why this is the case is because at the same time the Human Rights Act was created in 1998, you also had devolution. So you had referenda, okay? And my theory is that the process of voting for how your country is to be governed changes your relationship between the individual and the state. Okay, and this was a very significant moment where the sort of Brexit referendum, it was about many, many things, but I think a lot of people saw it as a sort of a statement about how they wanted to be governed. Did they want to be governed from Europe, or did they want to be governed here? Okay, so it was a choice in the very general sense of how to be governed. And I think that perhaps by being given that choice, it changed how we sort of see our relationship with the state. So, yes, parliamentary sovereignty may endure, okay? It exists. But, and I can't yet prove this, at a fundamental level, the act of voting changed changed what underpins parliamentary sovereignty. Previously, we just sort of accepted it. It's always existed, therefore we accept it. But through the act of voting in the referendum, the basis of that changed. So the basis of our constitution perhaps changed. There was a sort of rejection of absolute parliamentary sovereignty. I mean, it's equally possible that what didn't happen. Okay, there was a lot of debate at the time about reasserting sovereignty. Okay, and equally it could have been, the basis could not have changed, it could have just been a reassertion of what we always thought, that Parliament is sovereign and nothing has really changed, we've just re-established what we used to know. But if I am right, the fact that Parliament has sort of refused to sort of obey the executive over the last couple of years can be seen not just as a sort of function of the fact that the executive no longer has a majority within Parliament, but that they're sort of reflecting some sort of deeper movement underneath the Constitution. Does this make sense? Okay, yeah. So, but I don't know what the answer is. So maybe there's sort of something deeper going on. We all know that the Constitution moves by evolution, okay? But every now and again, you get something which evolution just can't deal with. Okay? And perhaps this referendum was one of those things that changed something fundamentally. And yeah, maybe we'd evolved up to that point, and then you get this sort of cataclysmic event in a nation, and something changes fundamentally. Vernon Bogdanor thinks that Brexit was a constitutional moment. He thinks that the continuity of the Constitution has sort of broken to some extent, and ultimately we will shortly, in the immediate future, have a written constitution. I mean, he's sort of written a draft for a written constitution, so he has a sort of personal interest in this. But he reckons this was a sort of constitutional moment. Okay, so that's the first thing. Okay, so we've got the referendum, okay? Ostensibly, perhaps something fundamental changed, but in practice, it was a sort of political force rather than any legal force. So the next question to come up in the Brexit process was the Article 50 debate. Okay, so after Article 50, Prime Minister resigns, goes off humming into the sunset, and to write his autobiography, which I greatly look forward to reading. And we had a leadership contest which left Theresa May as our Prime Minister after all the other candidates either stabbed themselves or each other in the back. I don't know if you stab yourself in the back or you shoot yourself in the foot by tradition. But yes. And there appeared to be still no detailed plan, as you know. Okay? We still didn't know quite what was going to happen. Who was supposed to sort of pull the trigger to take us out of Europe. And yeah, our unwritten constitution had no clear rule. So Article 50 of the Treaty of the European Union, inserted by the Lisbon Treaty at the insistence of the UK, sort of gave the mechanism for determining how we should sort of leave the European Union. So it says how the EU conducts its negotiations, it creates this sort of 2-year timetable for negotiation, and crucially it says that any member state may decide to withdraw from the Union in accordance with their constitutional requirements. But of course you can see the problem coming. We have an unwritten constitution. We didn't know quite what those constitutional requirements were. Okay, so this was sort of the first big substantive question. Okay? So the referendum was said not to be sufficient. That wasn't notification. It was said we needed something else. Okay? But we didn't know who had to send it in. And that precipitated a power struggle. The oldest power struggle we have in the United Kingdom between Parliament and the Crown. Okay, it goes all the way back to sort of Magna Carta. You can see that as the sort of the barons, and sort of the House of Lords, as we call it now, struggling with the Crown, literally the Crown, to control it. The English Civil War. Okay, the Roundheads and the Cavaliers. There's a tension for who should have power. Okay. Cavaliers favouring King Charles, okay, favouring sort of exercise of power through the prerogative, and the Roundheads, the parliamentarians, saying no, Parliament should have this role. They ultimately winning the English Civil War in 1651, And then sort of we get the Bill of Rights and the Act of Settlement and things like that. And the courts are sort of, so that's our sort of background struggle. And then we get the sort of, and the courts coming in as the referees, we've got the case of proclamations and things like that, okay? Saying the king can't change the common law, it has to be done through parliament, okay? Can't change statute, can't change the common law. And they ultimately had to decide. Miller, as we know, we all know what happened. Okay, the Supreme Court found the government didn't have the power. Parliament decided whether to trigger Article 50, and they give two reasons for this. So the first one, exercise of prerogative, would be inconsistent with the EU Act. Okay, so prerogative is subservient to acts of Parliament, so standard theory of parliamentary sovereignty. Okay, and to exercise prerogative to take us out of the European Union would be to act in a way which violated the European Communities Act, which brought us into the European Union. The government tried to argue that Section 2, subsection 2 of the EC Act allowed, which said that regulations and prerogative may be used to sort of give effect to such EC law as to time created or arising under the treaties. But the court said, no, that doesn't include the power to sort of get rid of it entirely, okay, sort of standard. But see, they're acting purely in accordance with the standard conception of parliamentary sovereignty, okay? Yeah, they didn't accept that the 1972 Act, the EC Act, contemplates or accommodates the getting rid of EU law entirely, okay? You can't abolish it by prerogative. Yeah, Ewing says, yep, this is a clear statement of parliamentary sovereignty. Okay. Now, yeah, you wouldn't have thought that to read the Enemies of the People headline, and maybe that suggests this sort of deeper movement in the background that I'm talking about, the shift between parliamentary power and sort of a wider sort of people power. But the courts weren't having that. And then you get their second reason. So they say, yep, can't. So that first reason, core parliamentary sovereignty. Nothing really to see here, very standard. The second reason, a bit more sort of questionable, okay? Okay, so they say you can't use prerogative to change fundamental constitutional rules. Okay. They said it would be inconsistent with the long-standing and fundamental principle that such big changes can't be made using ministerial power. The court said that the EC Act had unprecedented effect, unprecedented constitutional implications, creating this new sort of dynamic and overriding source of law, and that had had a big effect on our constitution, and to change that just through prerogative was exceeding the executive's powers. The court held that there was sort of another sort of implied limitation on prerogative, that you couldn't sort of use prerogative to sort of diminish individual rights. They cite the case of Sims for that, okay? You can't get rid of individual rights, including rights, they said, under the European Union law, although previously Sims was used for human rights law, so I'm not sure they're entirely as fundamental, but the court nonetheless said, no, there's fundamental rights at stake here, and you can't just do that using prerogative. So, fairly consistent with parliamentary sovereignty, okay? Yeah, the sort of fundamental constitutional change, perhaps not quite so clearly rooted in parliamentary sovereignty, more rooted perhaps in the rule of law, but again, the court sort of acting in accordance with fundamental constitutional principles. Nothing really has changed. I mean, although they went beyond the sort of the word, I mean, their first argument, that's purely sort of application of parliamentary sovereignty. Here, they're sort of going a bit further, okay? It upholds this sort of rule of law idea of sort of the executive as constrained by law, and that prerogative power is subject to limitations. However, beyond the wording of the EC Acts, these limits are quite uncertain, okay? And we know certainty is important to the rule of law, so perhaps this sort of creates a problem as well. Okay, so yeah, they're trying to justify it using the rule of law, that the executive must be sort of constrained, but at the same time the rule the courts are creating here is uncertain. Okay, so it's not perhaps entirely sort of consistent with that idea that we really like certainty under the rule of law. The court would argue that that was sort of justified by the deeper principles at play, the sort of protection of individual rights, the importance of sort of controlling the executive. You can almost see them sort of playing off one element of the rule of law, the sort of uncertainty, against the other element of the rule of law, and perhaps seeing that sort of control of the executive as the more important element. The weakness of this, of course, is that it depends on judicial interpretation. You're giving judges a lot of power to decide what is a constitutional principle. Okay? And that's great, so long as the judges are on your side. In terms of the separation of powers, the Miller judgment can be sort of seen as a sort of an application of the standard separation of powers. The majority can be seen from sort of preventing the executive from changing the law substantially, okay, which is a function of the legislature. The legislature gets to make big changes, the executive gets to administer the law. The Supreme Court also noted that if it accepted the government's arguments in Miller, and it was just up to prerogative to whether or not we could leave the European Union, then there would have been no need for a referendum, no need for an act of parliament. The Prime Minister could just have got up one day and decided, yep, we're off, okay? And that would have been a huge amount of power. So, large, substantial change to a lot of legislation, and arguably a usurpation of the legislature's power. So, again, we can sort of see this, the Miller decision, as fairly consistent with parliamentary sovereignty, rule of law, separation of powers. Okay, so far, so constitutional. I mean, under our separation of powers, we don't have this strict separation of powers. The executive has a lot of control over the legislature, but they must still, when they want to do big things, act through the legislature. And to sort of use Article 40, Article 50 using prerogative, that would have sort of been bypassing it entirely. Okay, so inconsistent with our separation of powers. Is everybody with me so far? Yeah? Okay. Right. So, what was the practical effect of Miller? Nothing really. Sort of within 3 months, Article 50 had been triggered. But it was important to sort of say who had this power. Okay, if the executive had just run off with the power, that would have set quite a dangerous precedent. It would have been contrary to the separation of powers, rule of law, parliamentary sovereignty. Okay, but they passed the Withdrawal Act within a couple of months, sent the letter off a couple of weeks later. I was on the same train. Also going to Brussels, but for personal reasons rather than anything exciting. And started the time limit, which is doing what its British drafters of Article 50 intended, which was to make sure that no country could ever be kept in the European Union forever against its will. That's why it has this sort of deadline. And if you sort of no withdrawal agreement, the option is out. It's to ensure that you're not trapped in the European Union forever. Well, that was the intention of the drafters. So, although the effect of Miller was to uphold the separation of powers between the branches of the government, the reality was that Parliament imposed no strict checks on the executive in sort of the triggering of Article 50. So, yep, that's the European Union Notification of Withdrawal Act. There are 2 provisions in it, and that is one of them. The other one is just about interpretation. It's tiny, okay? Parliament imposed no substantive check, okay? Arguably because of the wider politics. Okay, they felt that they couldn't do anything, and even if the opposition had sort of wanted to oppose it, the Conservatives had the outright majority, and would have won. However, that all changed, because, as we know, in order to get anything done, you need to control Parliament, if you're the executive. And the government was worried. They only had a very small majority, so they thought, well, we need a bigger majority to make sure that we can get this through. Okay, we can deliver on Brexit. And so they held a general election, and there were 2 unwritten rules of British general elections. These aren't unwritten constitutional rules. They just seem to be rules of legal practice. First one is that divided parties never win. Okay? Divided parties don't win general elections in the UK. The other one is, if you call a general election out of turn, you get punished by the voters for inconveniencing them. Okay? And in this situation, both rules applied. The Labour Party was divided, the Conservative Party called the election out of turn, and both were punished. Okay? Neither got a majority. And this ultimately leaves us where we are now. So we've got the Withdrawal Act, Article 50 is ticking, and we now have the question of who controls what happens next. So the Conservatives form a government with the DUP on a basis of confidence and supply, which means they'll vote with the government on a vote of no confidence, and they will approve sort of essential legislation like budgets, but that doesn't include sort of passing the EU law legislation. It was a very narrow deal. Okay, votes of confidence and basically the budget. Under our separation of powers, of course, the government normally has this strong control over Parliament. It has the whip system, party loyalty. Okay, it can control what Parliament does. Without the majority in our current Parliament and the controversial nature of Brexit, there's a question of the extent to which it's the lack of majority or the controversial nature of Brexit that has meant that this hasn't gone through. Even if the Conservatives had a majority, would we have seen this level of sort of rebellion by MPs? I don't know. I suspect we'd probably have seen quite a lot, but then with a large majority, you can handle a lot. I'm just not quite sure. Whatever we are where we are, and the government has suffered the worst parliamentary defeat in the democratic era. Okay, they cannot control Parliament. Okay, that is why we are where we are. Okay, and that is where our separation of powers, our normal rules of separation of powers, are not able to deal with the situation of Brexit. Okay, because normally you would have our sort of standard separation of powers. Our standard rules of government is the executive dominates Parliament. Okay. And without that, okay, our constitution just can't deal with this situation. Okay, we don't have the sort of mechanisms for how do you sort of get a sort of controversial piece of legislation through Parliament. We have an adversarial system. Okay? And that's basically what's causing the problems at the moment. We just can't, our system of government can't function without that sort of exec dominance of Parliament. So anyway, the first piece they try and get through is the EU Withdrawal Bill. Becomes the EU Withdrawal Act in 2018, and is subject to over 170 amendments, which is a huge amount. The purpose of the Act is to decide what happens when we leave the European Union, so Section 1 repeals the EC Act, but to ensure that there aren't great big gaps in the law, Part 2 of the Act makes provision for all existing EU law to be copy and pasted into the UK, so that we can sort of continue to function. Contains various other provisions to sort of deal with ministers spending money to prepare for Brexit and so on. The key constitutional issue raised by this is the question of the Henry VIII powers, which we talked about in the second separation of powers lectures. Okay, so not only did it sort of copy and paste EU law, it gave powers to deal with any sort of complications that might arise after Brexit date, when we were no longer sort of accepting EU laws, so our laws were sort of could go out of date, so we'd have to sort of potentially keep them up to date with EU law, or there might be sort of unforeseen clashes with domestic law. Okay, those are the, or we might just not like the EU laws we've got, and we might want to repeal them. Okay, and the Henry VIII powers in Section 8 give the power to do that, to deal with those situations by statutory instruments. Now, these powers were exceptionally broad, even by standard sort of Henry VIII powers. They were an unprecedented and extraordinary portmanteau, the House of Lords Constitutional Committee said. In their original form, they were practically unlimited. They would fundamentally change the balance between the powers of the government and of Parliament. But of course, Parliament can do this, because Parliament is sovereign, and an executive with a majority in Parliament may well have got these through. I mean, we've seen in the past, what was it, the Legislative Reform Act, 2006, okay, what was called the Abolition of Parliament Act. Okay, that was, I mean, there you had a government with a large majority, and Parliament was still able to check it, so even with a majority, trying to get this Withdrawal Act through, it's likely that Parliament would have imposed some limitations on it. but it's questionable whether Parliament would have been able to impose the amount of limitations on it that it did. But I don't want to mislead you, this does give a considerable amount of power. Okay, so we've got Section 8 there. Okay, that's one of the Henry VIII clauses. Power by regulation to revert, remedy or mitigate failure of retained EU law to operate effectively or any other deficiency in retained EU law. So that's EU law incorporated, but it doesn't just enable you to change EU law that's been incorporated, it also enables you to change Acts of Parliament, which are affected by retained EU law. Okay, so it's not just a power over sort of retained EU law, regulations, sort of pieces of sort of legislation that have been incorporated. It's other acts of Parliament that could in some way be affected or affecting. So if you've got a clash between an Act of Parliament and an Act of retained EU law, you can change the Act of Parliament. Okay, so it's not just, that is the sort of the scope of this. It's not just the retained EU law that you can change, it's the other laws sort of relevant to it. Section 9, the other Henry VIII power, is the power to make regulations to implement the withdrawal agreement. And this power can't be used until the withdrawal agreement is agreed, so Section 9 can't currently be used. Okay, Section 8 powers can be used, well if we withdraw. I think it can be used prior as well in some circumstances, but I'd have to double check that. Okay, so Parliament meant that greater restrictions were imposed. So we've got these sort of sifting committees ultimately, so if you make a regulation under Section 8, there's sort of a sort of special parliamentary committee to sort of make sure it's sort of not too great a power. But there's still the potential for the executive to override sort of a parliamentary sort of veto on a regulation if it says that it's imminent, okay, and there's nothing Parliament can do to sort of dispute the imminence of something. But a sort of emergency regulation under Section 8 can only sort of exist for 28 days. So, nonetheless, a very wide power. So, Eliot and Tierney describe the limitation of Section 8 as the greatest sort of influence that Parliament had on the bill. Okay, so they prevented the power being so open-ended. But the thing you have to remember is that this is a check that was brought about through political pressure. It isn't a constitutional feature. Okay, so the limitation of what sort of the executive can do under Henry VIII clauses is not something that's sort of laid down. There isn't a sort of clear provision in the separation of powers or parliamentary sovereignty that says this is the nature of a Henry VIII clause. It's what sort of political pressure can be brought to bear to limit it. Okay? With a bigger majority, there might have been less limitation. Not with any majority, there might have been greater limitation. So the extent of the rebellion on the various votes suggests that the issue that strong party discipline was not applying, and our traditional idea of the separation of powers, the executive in control of Parliament, broke down. Okay? You could see it starting to crumble during the Withdrawal Act debates. Okay? Post the Withdrawal Act debates now, you can really see the effect of this lack of executive control over Parliament. Okay? The rejection on the meaningful votes of the withdrawal agreement. So yeah, the meaningful votes. Okay, so this is potentially the crucial part, well, it was meant to be the crucial part of the Withdrawal Act, Section 13. Okay, this wasn't meant to be in the bill. Okay, this was not meant to be in the bill. The government did not want this. This is the Grieve Amendment. Okay? If the Prime Minister had got this majority, this is why the majority, this failure to win the general election was so crucial. Okay? And it shows you perhaps the weakness of the checks that are contained in the Constitution. If a provision to sort of impose this restriction on the executive was just as a result of how the general election turned out. Okay? This is the political constitution. Okay? There isn't a legal constraint here that sort of meant that this sort of restriction on the executive had to exist. Okay? So if the Prime Minister had got a majority, the bill would probably have stopped at sort of Section 8 and 9. Okay? But pressure from Parliament meant Section 13 was included. And it gave Parliament the final say on the UK's withdrawal by imposing a number of conditions. Okay, so the withdrawal agreement has to be approved by the House of Commons and has to be approved or at least debated by the House of Lords. And so it has to be, so we have to have a vote in the House of Commons, and that's what we've had 2 of already. When I was writing this, I thought we were going to have a 3rd, but I had to go through and cross that out because we've only had 2. Because sort of John Burko said, well, I'm not going to let you do that, which was great. And everyone went, what? What's he doing now? What was it? Somebody said, was it in the movie of Brexit, he was worried he was only going to have a sort of walk-on part, but he's now sort of guaranteed himself a sort of, he wants to be played by Brad Pitt, I think, or something like that. So we've only had the 2 meaningful votes, and even after the meaningful votes, you've got to get an Act of Parliament through as well, okay, to sort of confirm the withdrawal agreement. And if, as it stands, if there is no agreement following last night's European Council summit, we will leave on the 12th of April. So we've got a slight delay. If the 12th of April has been chosen because it's the last moment at which preparations could be begun for holding European Parliament elections. Okay, so if there hasn't been any vote in the Commons that says we're going to have European Parliament elections, then that is the point, I think, at which the European Union will say goodbye, and we'll be off. So Section 13(2) requires the withdrawal agreement to be put to members of the House of Commons. That's a meaningful vote. Yeah, and where this is rejected, the government has to come back with sort of next steps, amendable motions. These are sort of this is the sort of motion. Remember last week there was a vote that sort of voted against no deal. Okay, that was one of these next steps sort of debates. So you have a meaningful vote. Do you accept the withdrawal agreement? If that doesn't happen, then the government has to come back and say, right, we propose a motion saying, yep, we're going to keep talking, and then anybody can amend it, and one of the amendments that got passed said, no, we don't want no deal, but of course that won't prevent no deal at under EU law if everything isn't signed off by the 12th, because although that does create an interesting situation where we potentially leave at EU level but not at domestic level. I mean, I guess that would be that's the more problematic one in terms of chaos. I mean, the interesting one is if we agree at European Union level to continue, but don't pass an Act of Parliament to keep that going, to extend the leaving date, well, it's not so much extending the leaving date. This is so you've seen the cancelling of Article 50 and so on, opinion poll. The problem with that is that the withdrawal agreement, we have the Notification of Withdrawal Agreement Act, okay, which triggers Article 50, okay. But if we revoke. In order to revoke Article 50, we'd have to pass an Act of Parliament. I mean, the executive couldn't just do it by themselves, because there's been an Act of Parliament that says you've got to we've triggered Article 50. So there would presumably need to be another Act of Parliament saying we're untriggering it. But I mean, you can pass an Act of Parliament in a day if you really have to. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So the significance of Section 13 was the increased control it gave Parliament over the executive. But then how much of a control really was this? Okay? It meant that the executive could not agree the withdrawal agreement without the approval of an Act of Parliament, and thus Parliament has this veto over the withdrawal agreement. One of the weaknesses of the meaningful vote provision is the executive retained control over when the meaningful votes would be, and indeed how many there would be. Okay? So perhaps that was a provision that should really have gone in Section 13 to so yes, Parliament managed to tell the executive, yes, you must come back and talk to us, but they forgot to say when, okay? And what we've seen is the government delaying it until the last minute to put pressure on Parliament to agree. What is the last minute keeps on changing. I'm not entirely sure when the last minute will actually be. But So yeah, I guess they didn't think that the executive would do that, but they did. So the other weakness of the meaningful vote procedure is that Parliament has no direct say over what was in the withdrawal agreement. Okay, so that was entirely done by the Conservative Party and mostly by the Prime Minister and sort of in negotiation with various factions within the Conservative Party. Okay? And these weaknesses of sort of not controlling the timing of the meaningful vote, not controlling the withdrawal agreements, are sort of consistent with our standard separation of powers, under which sort of the executive has control over Parliament, over the business of the House of Commons, so it's fairly standard for them to decide when motions will be debated. Okay? And the executive is supposed to conduct international relations, which they did under the withdrawal agreement. Okay? So these weaknesses in the Section 13 meaningful procedure are pretty much consistent with our standard sort of separation of powers. What we're getting now, or what was sort of attempted last 13 in the Ben Cooper-Letwin amendment, was to bypass this meaningful vote system, to get round these problems, to sort of end government control over parliamentary business, okay? So that Parliament could then sort of decide when to have the meaningful votes, what to vote on, but that was defeated by 314 votes to 311, okay? The idea of that sort of amendment was Parliament would take control and then it could sort of have indicative votes on what options do they want. So did they want a long sort of extension? Did they want sort of the Article 50 procedure? What was the sort of nature of any deal might they like? Okay, so that was Parliament trying to sort of wrest power. So this tension between, this sort of conflict between the executive and Parliament that goes all the way back to sort of Magna Carta, you see it sort of playing it out. And at the moment, the executive still seems to be more in the driving seat than Parliament, but this is what we will find out next week. Is that going to change? Is Parliament going to sort of take control away from the executive? That would be contrary to our normal understanding of the separation of powers. Okay? The executive is supposed to control Parliament under our separation of powers. And so far, that is what is happening. This is entirely consistent with our Constitution. Okay? It's creating a problem at the moment because the executive doesn't have the numbers to truly exercise control and get the bill through and everything. Do you see? Okay, so this is what our situation at the moment is as a result of the executive trying to act in accordance with the normal understanding of the separation of powers. It should sort of decide what Parliament sort of debates. It should decide what is in international sort of agreements. Okay, so the government is acting as it should under our standard understanding of the separation of powers. Okay, but the problem is it doesn't have the power within Parliament to do that properly. Okay, to do that how it normally would. Okay, so that the government is having these defeats, okay, shows how important sort of party discipline is, our first past the postum system of majority is to the functioning of our constitution. Okay? And it shows how difficult it is for Parliament to exercise control. Yes?
Last week the guest lecturer mentioned blamed David Cameron for the situation where Parliament could lose a vote of historic proportions back in January and Theresa May could keep her job.
Yes, I'm just going to come on to this, and I think this is crucial. So that's why I put the Withdrawal Act in your bundle. Okay? So a constitutional crisis. Okay? This is a constitutional crisis. Anybody seen The Italian Job? Okay? You need to watch The Italian Job. Okay? So at the end, they do the bank heist and the bus is hanging over the cliff. Okay? And that's pretty much where we are now. Okay? The bus being sort of the United Kingdom. I'm not sure what's written on the side, but there it is. It's over the cliff. So a constitutional crisis is either a breach of the constitutional rules or it's a situation that the Constitution can't resolve. Okay? Now what I've argued, and you may disagree, is that all the constitutional actors have acted according with the constitutional rules. Okay? So Miller, the court, applied parliamentary sovereignty, the separation of powers, and the rule of law. Okay? The Prime Minister has tried to act in accordance with the normal rules of the separation of powers. She has tried to dominate Parliament, okay? She has tried to keep control, okay? Parliament have done their proper function, they have tried to check the executive, okay? So everybody is trying to act in accordance with the standard sort of constitutional rules. Unfortunately, this is not an ordinary situation, and so the ordinary rules of our constitution have not worked. So I would argue it's the second sort of crisis. Okay, it's not the first, nobody's breaking the rules here. It's rather that the rules of our constitution cannot deal with this situation. Okay? So I'd say, and at the core of this is the hung parliament. Okay? So you've got the hung parliament, which means you don't have that sort of that control of parliament by the executive that our separation of powers involves. And also I think in there somewhere is the cross-party nature of Brexit. Okay, so it's usually the two parties line up on their own sides. But there's something about the nature of Brexit. It's so controversial that it sort of breaks party loyalty. Okay? And it's also meant that the executive hasn't been able to dominate Parliament. But equally, Parliament hasn't been able to dominate the executive either. Okay, so parliamentary sovereignty says, yes, Parliament is ultimately in control. And you'd expect that if sort of the executive couldn't dominate Parliament under the standard separation of powers, then we default back to parliamentary sovereignty as our sort of ultimate rule. Okay? But Parliament hasn't been able to take back control so far either. Okay, and this is the question for next week. Will we switch from the sort of standard separation of powers of exec dominance back to parliamentary sovereignty? Okay, they haven't done it so far. Firstly, I think because of deference to the referendum. Okay, this is why I sort of had this idea at the beginning of this shift in sovereignty. Okay, Parliament doesn't feel that it's entirely sovereign to go against sort of the referendum. I think that was probably true in the immediate aftermath of the referendum. I wonder if that's still true now. Because that was a political sort of effect on parliamentary sovereignty. It was limited by the referendum. I suspect the politics may have changed. We will see next week. Or maybe the week after, or the week after that, depending on when the extension happens. It's just, okay, so one reason Parliament hasn't taken control is perhaps because of deference to the referendum. The second reason is that the MPs have not reached consensus. So in countries that don't have first past the post, that aren't used to sort of strong executives, you will get sort of cross-party negotiation, okay? But that is alien to our sort of political system. We don't usually need compromise, okay? So we haven't sort of really attempted to achieve it. And it's only really now, sort of in the last couple of weeks, right at the end, when we've realised that the normal rules of our constitution aren't working, that we've realised that some sort of cross-party negotiation is perhaps the way to go. Okay? So I say in the thing, constitutional crisis bug or function, okay? In ordinary times, this deadlock would have been solved by holding a general election, okay? So normally, okay, if a government fails on its key piece of legislation, okay? So with our government, that would be the withdrawal agreement, okay? If that got voted down, then the government would fall, okay? That would be the convention, okay? But we have the Fixed Term Parliament Act now, okay? Which means that in order for a government to fall, it must lose a vote of no confidence, okay? We had one of those, but we still had this sort of strong enough party loyalty, okay, that the government was able to endure, okay? And perhaps by the government not resigning, by MPs not sort of bringing about a general election, that is unconstitutional, okay? Perhaps the Fixed Term Parliament Act here is what is breaking the Constitution, okay? Because if Parliament's supposed to be sovereign, okay, and supposed to be able to govern, okay, these are the things that are getting in the way. Okay, the convention would normally have the government resigning and bring about the election so that we could get this strong executive that our sort of separation of powers involves. Okay? But the Fixed Term Parliament Act is one of the things sort of preventing that. It's not the only thing, okay? Because sort of the government could sort of say, because we had the vote of no confidence, and the MPs said, no, we still have confidence in this government that's failing in its key purpose. Okay? So, yeah, so I think ultimately that's sort of part of what's at the root of it. Okay, our constitution says Parliament should be sovereign and the executive should dominate Parliament, but that can't happen because we don't have a majority and we can't solve that problem. Okay, and there are two ways of solving that problem. One is you go for a sort of consensus model with MPs talking to each other. The other is you have a general election and you have a new government, which can dominate the Parliament in accordance with our normal separation of powers. Okay? So yeah, so